You ready? Okay.
Yes.
Bueno, pues buenas tardes.
So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this round table that we have organized within the Nordic Days agenda. I would like to remind you that this is a festival that was started in 2010, and it became an inexcusable appointment with the brand of the Nordic countries. The scene, the cultural scene comes closer to Spain and to Latin America, and we generate an exchange between two regions. I think it is an exchange that is becoming more and more consolidated, and it's becoming even better as the different editions go by. This platform for cultural exchange with artists of both sides of and also of both sides of the Atlantic, we come into a dialogue and we build bridges that I believe are very necessary. We are talking about musicians, designers, artists, and of course writers as the four writers that we have with us this afternoon. I am going to make a brief introduction about each of them. I will start on my left. I have Arlen Lu, who is a novelist, a cinema critician. He works in Oslo, and he created the Screenwriters Oslo agency. Naive Super, which was published by the Editorial Nórdica in Spain, describes the generational framework of the 1990s, which is still very present, very up to date. And the person he talks about has no work, doesn't study, and he's just looking for himself. And he now has a more dark humor and more ironic literature, and he has written a book which is a satire about saving the planet. On my left, I have I hope I can pronounce that right, Kirsty Skomsvold. I don't know if I've pronounced that right. She studied mathematics and IT engineering, and he had a debut with Jo fortere Jeggar, Jo mindre Jeg. It has been translated into 25 languages, and it's very original and emotional, and it describes the most absurd aspects of the proximity of death. He has written poems which have been welcomed by the critics, and she has published her fifth book, a book about a child, where she writes quite an honest letter to his baby with an excellent literary quality, and that deals with different aspects, very profound aspects. I have also Ernesto Pérez Zúñiga. He has been working as a professor. He has been an editor of literary collections, and now he works at the central headquarters of the Cervantes Institute here in Madrid. And Ernesto studied in Granada, where he published his first poems. He also is an author of essays and different literary editions, and part of his work has been translated into French and Romanian and some other languages as well. And last but not least, I have Mónica Ojeda. She has a degree in social communication with a degree in literature. Her first novel, Desfiguración Silva, won the Alba Prize in 2014, and it received the national award in 2015. Nefando, which was published by Candaya, her second novel, was included as one of the 10 books which represent the new boom of Latin American literature. In 2018, at the beginning of this year, she published her most recent novel, which is Mandíbula, which more or less depicts fear in its different forms, quoting you. Now, after this round of introductions, I would like to establish a bridge as well among all of you, a bridge through words, since you are writers, and a bridge that allows you to establish a dialogue and to see what things we have in common, we share. It seems that there are not too many, but I'm sure that we will discover some new ones. Literature, Norwegian literature, and also Spanish and Latin American literature. I know that there are not many relationships between those two sides of literature, those two nationalities, and so this is an opportunity to build bridges. To start with, I would like you to take the floor. As we go by, you can take turns however you like. And I would like to propose something about what are the characteristics that describe each of those two types of literature. In your case, the Latin American and the Spanish literature, the different sides of the Atlantic, and in your case, Norwegian literature. And I would also like to know whether those two literatures are fully different or the other way around, and whether there is something that brings them closer to each other. That's what I would like you to start with. Ernesto, it is your turn. Well, talking about the characteristics of Spanish literature and Latin American literature, the present one, of course, we are not going to talk about the whole history of literature, is very difficult, really, because there is a huge diversity in the types of literature. But just to focus a little bit more, the main difference that I can find between Norwegian literature and the literature that is written in Spanish is that in Spanish we write literature that is developed in Spain and in South America. So it is written from a very different type of country, a whole different framework. I'm not going to talk about the one that is written in Catalonian or Basque or Galician language, but it is encompasses the half of the world with very different perspectives, as different countries have specific qualities and characteristics, and of course there is a different filter to each writer and to each author. And of course we are talking about a huge diversity within the world of Latin American literature. In order to classify that, it would really take a huge effort, and it is like classifying all the species of animals in the world. So I don't think we can talk about common characteristics in Spanish literature, but we can talk about a richness, a wealth of diversity that comes from that diversity of the cities, of stories, of nationalities, of different social circumstances. Madrid and Argentina can be very different to a small village in Mexico or Ecuador or in Venezuela. So there is a huge diversity. I think that could be one of the main characteristics that describes Latin American literature. But I also believe that there is something that links us all together, and that is that the majority of writers of this environment, what Carlos Fuentes called the La Mancha territory, is precisely that those are traditions or a diversity that we do know that has influenced all of us in many different ways. I have spoken to many friends and many colleagues in Latin America, and we always tell jokes about this, because when I was 20 years old and I was reading Latin American literature more than anything, that was due to the fact that I didn't find so interesting the literature that was written in Spain at that point in time, and many people were reading Spanish literature because they believed that that was more interesting. So we are raised in different circumstances, perhaps in some cases in paradoxical circumstances, because we are reading opposite types of literature. But I think that things that have been written in the 20th century have been very innovative, both in terms of poetry and also narrative, and there are things that have influenced all of us equally, I guess. The most clear example would be Borges. That we can talk about Borges, who was an author that, thanks to whom we found out about Norway before anyone else. Also Gabriel García Márquez, and those are authors that we all have read in this huge territory of La Mancha, that country we all come from. But our main characteristic is a wealth, a richness, a diversity that really encompasses all types of literature. In the 21st century, we are witnessing a huge transformation, because we are now coming to know about each other. We share cities, we share festivals, we come together every now and then, and we now can put a face on other peoples. Now we talk about that. This talk that we are having right now can be followed through streaming in the web of the Telefónica, Fundación Telefónica space. So I would like to welcome all the people who are watching us through the streaming. Arlen, I would like to ask you, Ernesto has provided a summary, quite a very specific summary of what we could call Latin American literature with its own characteristics. Can you open up for us? Can you illustrate us on what are the main features, the main characteristics that would define Norwegian literature? If you had to define it, how would you do that?
Okay. First of all, I would like to say that I think it's a lot of similarities between people writing anywhere, because it's a way of living, it's a way of observing, thinking about life, and the conditions under which you live influence this. So I think if you are a writer in Madrid or in a Scandinavian city, you're probably likely to be more similar than if you live in the western coast of Norway and in some remote place of Spain. So I think that's the most important things. I mean, we all write because there is some experiences or emotions that we are dealing with, want to put into words, and that's a lot of similarities. That's why we can pick up a Latin American book or a Japanese book or any book and still understand what it's about, because it's about living and being human. That's the most important thing. Norwegian literature, what could I say? It's very easy often to enter a landscape of cliches when you are going to circle that in. But of course, the obvious thing is remote landscape, very far, sometimes from town to town, dangerous nature, weather, very hard conditions. Those are the themes that have been exploited a lot, and of course also interpersonal relationships, like in any literature. But that's a cliche of it. And only a couple of days ago I was at another event in Trondheim in Norway, and I spoke to a Norwegian writer that came from Chile when he was 10 years or so, and he talked about going occasionally now back to Chile, and it's enormously different because it's never quiet, it's people everywhere, and his relations, his family in Chile, they when he say I'm okay, can I just be by my own? They don't even believe it. You know, it must be something that he's not telling us. So let's get all the cousins and every member of the family here, so we can cheer him up. And that makes him very nervous. And I think that's a Norwegian thing, Scandinavian thing. I know it certainly from Norway and Sweden, especially even maybe from Finland, where there's a wonderful Finnish writer. He told me once that he spent a summer at his cabin, and every time he heard something, some walking and knocking, he was very relieved when they just was passing by. Oh, it was not someone coming to visit me. I was very happy about that. So that's Scandinavian. And also my father, when he comes to visit me from Trondheim, I live in Oslo, when he has taken the train and no one was there sitting together with him, and I asked, how was your trip? It was wonderful. I didn't have to speak to anybody. So that's, I think, the core of something of the Scandinavian literature, the silence, the loneliness, and the need for that. Yeah, that's what I would say first.
Kirsty, aparte de...
Kirsty,
maybe after this talk you will understand.
Yeah.
Okay.
Apart from the cliches that Arlen has mentioned, of course he has put on the table something that I believe is essential, which is that thing that brings us all closer in the end, and be either we come from Norway, from Ecuador, or wherever. It is literature. That is the vehicle that we share and that we express ourselves through, and that is what we have in common. And I would like to know, Kirsty, I would like to know whether it was interesting for you as a writer to delve deeper, to drill deeper into the origins of Latin American literature. Have you had any contact with Spanish writers or authors beyond Borges, that was mentioned by Ernesto a while ago? Have you felt that curiosity for Latin American literature? What do you know about them? And what has touched you?
I was scared that you would ask me this question. I think we have more work to do when building bridges. But yes, can I start a bit with the first question as well? Because I was thinking while you were talking, and it comes to the second one as well, because I don't know if it's that interesting dividing it so much and making generalizations like that, because you know, every fall the book comes out in Norway and the newspaper are trying to make it, I don't know, simple in some way and categorize it and say, oh, this fall the books are about this or the books are about that. But then I think we're missing the points of literature when we only look at the themes. So I think it goes deeper than that. And whether you're reading Latin American writers, Spanish writers, or Norwegian writers, if you write about loneliness, like my first novel, and I can travel to Beijing and meet people who are surrounded by, or like the guy you talked about from Chile, I'm sure he can feel lonely surrounded by all of his family. So I think that if you go a bit deeper, we're not that different, and yes.
Ese es el secreto de la literatura.
Is that the secret? Is that the secret of literature?
Things that we share as human beings.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know, you can perhaps say that Norwegians write about this topic and Latin Americans write about this, but it's, I don't know if, I I'm never interested in ideas when I'm writing. I'm interested in, or I don't have any. And you know, writers have been writing about the same things for forever. Death, loneliness, being ill. Not that much about having children. We just discovered in Norway, but they're coming too. That's the great thing about literature, that we write about the same things, but we're still hopefully able to say something new, or do it in a different way. And when you're reading, you're like thinking about the sentences, and maybe like, how do this writer use commas, or does it feel like he's that everything happens the moment he's writing, or is he telling stories that he's been thinking about for years, maybe his whole life? So I don't know, it's another way of reading, maybe. Yeah.
No, I can wait, but...
No, please.
Please?
Yes.
Okay. It was a comment, but another important thing that I didn't say in my first point was that the conditions of the society is, of course, very, very defining for how writers from a certain area will deal with things. And in Norway, the year when I was born, 1969, we happened to win the lottery and find oil outside our coast, lots of it. Before that, it was a social democracy with quite a lot of progress being done with the social standards, and the standard of living was gradually raised after the war, and rights for becoming ill and still getting your payment, etc. All these kinds of welfare state basics were built up. And then we found oil. And then gradually this money has changed us dramatically. So it would be impossible for us now to write the kinds of novels that they did in the 50s, simply because it's a totally different society. All this working together, building the country up again after the war has vanished, and it's now so much about material wealth. We think of ourselves as some kind of environmental lighthouse, but at the same time we are actually living from what makes this problem grow. So it's a double morale that's almost fantastic. And to expose this is very necessary as a writer in Norway today, in one way or another. So that's, I would say, is one of the main changes that my generation have experienced and grown up with, and seeing now the results from. In the 90s, not further back than that, it was not acceptable to show off your wealth. Even if you had money, you were hiding it, and maybe you were proud of it, but you didn't really show it off. And now it's going bananas in a way. People have cottages, cabins in the mountains that are bigger than their houses in the city, with warm garages that can be controlled, you know, from your mobile phone, etc. You can drive your 1 million kroner Tesla right into the garage in the mountain, etc. So there's no limit to it. And that's probably different from what Spanish writers are writing about right now.
But I must disagree a bit, because do you really?
Course.
Yeah. I can't buy a car, so I can't afford a car. But do you really think that we can't write novels like Hamsun, Sult? I think there are novels that have this eternal feeling to it, and that they could be written now as well. And there are some novels that feel dated just after 2 years or something. So I think it depends a lot on how you're writing, and more than what you write about. Like, yeah.
Yeah, that's true also. But
Even if you have a Tesla in your garage, you can feel ill and write about that, maybe in a way that someone could do 100 years ago.
Everything is possible, but I think that the novels that were written in between the wars, they were very much more about building some kind of well, I shouldn't say model society, but getting basics there. And now the basics are there, and they have become vulgar, and we are beyond it, and it's much more everyone for himself. And of course you can write about anything, but if you want to comment on recent development and society and how we are living and thinking, and how the middle class have in a way become perverted, it's very difficult to look in another direction than this. Money, follow the money, as they say. Yeah.
Yo esperaba que las discusiones se establecieran.
I was expecting the debate to rise between the two sides of the ocean, but I see that this is different. Now that Alan has brought about the topic of the interests of each country changing as generations pass and years go by, I would like to ask Monica, and since we've also spoken about cliches and all these labels that us journalists love to put on books, I would like to ask you, what is what we really do not know about Latin American literature? I'm asking this because after using so many cliches and labels and putting certain books in certain shelves, in order to facilitate readers the choosing books, we might have forgotten how diverse literature is in Spanish literature here and on the other side of the Atlantic. We're past the Latin American boom. Well, before I start talking about this, I would like to say something about what has been discussed based on what you have said. I think something that could be a difference between Norwegian writing and Latin American writing. I'm going to say this very carefully. Because I'm very worried about you being asked about Norwegian literature, you being asked about Spanish literature, and me asked about Latin American as a whole continent literature. I think that, just to mention one of the differences, and this is something we do not usually discuss, when we are asked about what Latin American literature is, we talk about different categories: the boom literature, the fantastic, the exotic aspects, which is the way that Latin American literature became known to the rest of the world. Everybody said how exotic, how interesting these writers are, and so this is the way we got into the world's literature. But there's another category, which is violence, which has been pretty much exploited. This is a real aspect. Our continent is extremely violent, so there's a lot of literature on this violence, and indeed is a very important topic for us. And that's another category, violence about drug dealers, etc. And then there's another category that we're working on the recent years, and that I have seen, especially about this female writers boom in Latin America, is to try and connect very different types of literature written by female writers, because they deal with the horror topic, the obscure topic, the monsters topic, when actually this has been dealt with in Latin American literature and worldwide also. This is a topic that has been dealt with in literature for many years. So this is not really a new or current category. But when we talk about Latin American literature, in order to avoid cliches and violence and Latin American boom and there's female writers, category, it would also be interesting to talk about guilt. What do you mean by guilt? And I'm just talking about my own country, about Ecuador. For writers, for those of us who write, there's a certain guilt, a sort of class guilt, because in Ecuador, writing literature is not accessible to everyone. This is a reality because of the levels of poverty in Ecuador, the social issues in my country, in my city. There is no public library. There is one single public library, which is the city library, and you cannot take out any books, and you cannot current books. There are only 19th century books and further back. So indeed, if you cannot take the books home, and if you're an Ecuadorian woman born in a poor household, it's very difficult for you to have access to books. You don't have any books close to you, and also you have to deal on a daily basis with just surviving. In order to write, you need time. As Virginia Woolf said in The Room, many Latin American writers have this room. Others write in cafeterias or on the street or wherever they manage. But even if you're a writer who has to write in a coffee shop, you still are charged with this guilt because you went to school, you had access to books, you learned to write. It's very shocking that in 2018 we're still talking about this. But this is really happening right now, and it's very important that we are speaking about it now, because we are not aware about this. 90% of society, of readers, of newspapers readers and literature readers are not aware of the fact that this is currently happening in Ecuador. Yes, it is happening, and it also happens in other countries in Latin America, and I haven't traveled all over the continent, so I cannot be certain that this is happening everywhere, but it definitely happens in Ecuador, which is a very small country, and if you have access to books and to writing, at least you are a privileged person within a country where people lack all these privileges. Therefore, writing in Ecuador has had a great social commitment that has had some important aspects to it, and also there were some low points. As a writer, to have a social position and commitment is important, but to a certain extent I think that this has become sort of compression shirt that it doesn't really allow us to write about other things. If you didn't write about ethnic discrimination, if you didn't write about that for many years in Ecuador, you were not committed with the cause of fighting racism. So I think that these are very characteristic features of our country. Ernesto, Monica just mentioned something that has opened my eyes, which is reading as a privilege and writing as a privilege. One of the things that I'm thinking about as this debate moves forward is that if reading can really be understood as a universal language, is reading a universal language? Do we read the same way in Spain and in Norway, in London as in Ecuador? Do we read the same way everywhere, or this is not the case? As Monica was speaking, I was thinking about the situation of literature in Ecuador and in other places where social situations are very strong. Concerning guilt, I can tell you that we have the same issue here in Spain. Writers write and people do not read. It doesn't matter if they went to school or not. or that if their wealth is better or not. Please don't throw us any urban legends. People are reading. Well, let's imagine that all the people present here are readers, and that the majority of us are readers. But the truth is that we don't read that much, and even in those countries where people are more literate and have had education for longer, people do not read as much. So I think that a great part of our society is actually devoted to consuming, to buying other type of products that are not books. I have certain allergy to words like products, and I think that our society is too much based in commerce and trade. But what you were saying really is a contrast between there's a contrast between what happens in Ecuador and what happens in Norway, a rich society facing a poor society, and the roles of literature in each of these places. And you were asking me if reading is the same everywhere, and I think it is. What doesn't change anywhere is the human soul. I was also thinking, as I was hearing you speak, that social conditions of each generation or of each human being is reflected in literature, as all the smells and all our experiences are reflected in literature. Some writers, depending on their personality, feel obliged to create a certain literature with an intellectual viewpoint, like it used to happen in the communist era with the communist realism. Or sometimes there are certain people who write from a certain mental side. Writers are different in the way from where they write their books, from a side of their a mental side, a mind side. I'm sorry, I'm speaking like we speak in my region of Spain. Some writers write from an intellectual perspective or from an intellectual part of their brains, and some other writers write from their silence, or they write from their soul, if you want. There are different places where you find the source for your words, and if you get rid of everything and of all the writers who have existed before you, and the society that surrounds you, your identity, your name, the place where you've been born, etc., and if you remove all the circumstances that surround you, everyone writes about the same thing, and as Herste said, we would write the same things. And I think that we all read the same. So when we write from our minds and our souls, we read from our souls and we read from our minds. So a book, I think, is the place where you can find somebody else in the fullest way. It's two intimacies, that of the person who wrote the book, and the person who is reading the book, who find themselves in the silence, and it's the collision or the encounter between two minds or the two souls. And I think that all can read and write from the same place.
Now we are talking about taking sides, or writing from one side or the other, and how to connect with each other in some way through words. When we started this conversation, before we came to the stage, we were discussing with Alan how that massive presence of the American culture we have suffered, that invasion of United States literature, of the so-called bestsellers and the label of bestseller in the New York Times that guarantees them a place in our bookstores. Alan was saying that presence is not like that in Norway, was not exactly like that, and it was surprising to discover that in Spain and some Latin American countries that is the case.
I don't have the numbers to give you, but there are probably people in the room that has these numbers. But of course we have American culture in Norway, we have American movies, and we have bestsellers. But if you look at what people are discussing and look at what the newspapers are writing about, that's very rarely the American bestseller. So we have an undergrowth of Norwegian fiction that is living quite comfortably on its own and that people are interested in, and also quite a number of translated books from other parts of Europe, not all parts of Europe. For example, I don't follow this closely, but I'm not very often discovering Spanish books. I guess they are there, but compared to English or other Scandinavian books or German or even Italian, they are fewer. And I wouldn't say at all, actually, that the American bestsellers are dominating the Norwegian talks about books or the buyers' habits. They are more interested in the new Norwegian novel than in the whatever American novel. Most of the time, that's my impression. Yeah.
¿Y consideras, Kersti?
Kersti, do you consider that fact makes you protect Norwegian literature and Norwegian culture in a better way, that perhaps that makes it easier for you to start writing, for someone from Norway to start to publish? Do you think that is the case?
If it's easier to start writing in Norway because we're protective of Norwegian literature. That might be. I don't know what it's like to start writing in other countries, but I know that we're very fortunate in Norway with we have something called innkjøpsordningen, so that all the libraries buy books that are bought in, and you are guaranteed a certain amount of money when you have a book published. But first, I don't know if it's, well, the hard part is writing a good novel, I guess. And I was sending it in the mail to a publisher, and people in the States, for example, I don't know what it's like in Spain, are always surprised by that, because you have to have an agent before you can even consider having someone looking at your script.
No imprescindible, pero...
Aquí es recomendable.
Also in Spain?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, it's not like that in Norway, so you can just send it and they will look at it.
You don't have agents there?
No. Agents for selling it to other countries, but not to have it published in Norway. Maybe it's because we're so few that they have time. Every Monday, every Monday at my publishing house, they are looking at the manuscripts that have been sent in, and they're reading it, and yeah, this looks good, and they're calling. Yeah, but and then they have, I don't know what it's like in Spain. I worked with editors for a couple of years before my first novel was published, and they feel very committed to working with you so that you will write more novels. And so I feel very well taken care of. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But this is just a short comment. This is not because we have political system that protects Norwegian literature. It's because people really want
like to read.
to read Norwegian literature.
Y creo que
sí. And I believe, Monica, you can tell your case. In Ecuador, the rate of people that read is quite low for the reasons that I have just mentioned. The truth is that national literature, the ones that publish with national publishers, which are normally independent publishers because there is no headquarters of Random or any of those big monsters, editorial monsters or publishing houses. The only thing that we have is Random Colombia, and that is the closest. So independent publishers suffer a lot in Ecuador. They can come forward really with difficult circumstances. They don't have privileged space or areas in the bookstores. There are very few bookstores. We just have like FNAC or something like that. The majority are those, and the people who work there don't read much, don't know much about books, and so we don't have that figure of really a bookseller that really knows. There are just a few of those, and so national literature is not really on the bookshelves. They are normally talking about foreign literature, English literature and also Spanish literature. Those are the ones that you see in the shop windows. And it is very difficult to make our literature visible. The Ecuadorian writers do not feel themselves well taken care of. And in Spain it is quite curious because that boom created or generated excellent literature, but it also created a figure that is the agent. The big literature was published in commercial publishers or publishing houses, or that have become commercial ones. And there was an agent always behind writers that was promoting the writer, and that on many occasions he was making a living out of that. And he was like the ones that published Garcia Marquez or Vargas Llosa, and those people have made a living, and they have been publishing in commercial publishing houses, and they have all made money, both the agent and themselves. But our generation, we thought that we were going to have a similar framework, and that we needed to have an agent, that we had to publish with those publishers because those were the ones that had published good literature in the last 20 years. What happened? In Spain, as in many parts of the world, there was a commercial approach to everything, and the commercial product became very widespread. And within the publishers that are publishing good literature and were publishing good literature, they started to publish what was selling well, or what they thought that would sell well, vis-a-vis or as opposed to the good criteria of what a good literary work should be. And so it became fashionable within the editors and the agents, and they said this is too literary, and it was like something despicable. It was like an offense, like an insult to you. It was too literary, and go to hell. This is not going to have a place, or it's not going to have to sell, really. But in the last few years, in the last, I would say 15 years more or less, that has really changed, and we have reversed that trend. Many good publishers have emerged, independent ones, both big and small, or medium-sized and small, and some big ones, and literature has become again the most important part. And in those ones, those publishers, the editor is very important, and they can be caring and sympathetic empathetic with you, but they don't care about the text. They only have commercial criteria when they judge a book. But now, in a good publisher, the editor really plays a very important role. He knows a lot, he helps you, he takes part in the process, and he collaborates and cooperates with you in a very proactive way. Like Candaya, for example, that is one of the cases. In Galaxia Gutenberg, John Tarrida, who is the editor, is a very good one. And then in Alianza Editorial, my previous publisher, the same. They are editors that really get involved. They know that you are writing literature, and that and they have to promote that, and they really commit to you and to your work. It is like a marriage to some extent with you. He is going to publish with us, and I'm going to take care of you, and I'm going to turn you into something big. And that is emerging in Spain again, and I think that it is here to stay. Because literature is necessary, and we have to really fight against commercial criteria. Things end up in their place. Regarding what I was saying about Ecuador, the independent publishers, since they know that they are not going to sell, they really publish what they want to publish, because they know that they are not going to sell a lot anyway, and they publish that which they trust. So when you have access to the independent publishers in Ecuador, it is very easy to find good literature, because they know that that is not a business, that you are not going to make a lot of money. Nobody opens a publishing house because you think that you are going to make a lot of money, because no, they are just the opposite. They are like kamikaze. And I also say that Candaya is like a kamikaze, because they are that type of editor. They risk themselves, they run risks, and they bet on good literature. So we have put on the table something which is that the topic, or the word commercial. I would like you to explain whether in Norway do you have commercial literature. Commercial, does it have the same meaning that it has in Spain? Is it something despicable, or to consider something commercial as opposed to something that is literary?
Yes, of course we have that, but we don't, how should I put it, during the last 15-20 years a lot of crime writing has not only from Norway but in Scandinavia become, from what I understand, quite high quality. It's traveling the world. And it's really selling a lot. Some of the world's best-selling crime writers come from Scandinavia, and the best-selling one comes from Norway. That is, of course, I would say, the category of commercial writing, more than much of the other genres that we are dealing with. But there's no one suspecting Jon Espe or the others for exploiting this. He's just writing what is best in the world at, of course, and it's selling a lot. So I think this has helped this division to actually be less divided. So it's not so dirty anymore to write those kinds of genres, because they are becoming more nuanced. They are also dealing with social questions. The main characters are no longer the cliches that there used to be, etc. So they're taking elements from what we normally or earlier used to call quality literature and merging them into this literature. So that's that's developing. And I would just like to make one other point regarding what you said, Monica, about a violent society. Norway must be one of the least violent societies in the world, and so there's very few chances of dying of random violence. I will have food, I know it, even next year, and my children will have their education. So all these things are in place. And then what do you write about? I think if you break it down, you will not see a lot of this political, hardcore, angry stuff, because it's working. Everything's working. So it becomes more introvert. It becomes more about relationships. It becomes more about the writer's divorce the year before. How did I deal with that, etc. All these kinds of things that, if you're living in a violent society where changes are overdue, you simply do not write about those things. So that's one big difference, I would say.
Y en el caso de la...
And in the case of, just to try to close this conversation and also to give the opportunity to our audience to ask questions to you, just to close the loop, so to speak, Monica has proposed something which is a social function of literature. You have spoken about how that people pass judgment on you if you do not accept that social commitment through your books. And I would like to ask you about how do you see the role that a writer or the author should play from the point of view of social commitment? Should it be a proactive commitment, or should it be like a denounce, or should he or she stay on a margin and leave it aside?
Rompo otra vez el hielo.
Venga, Ernesto.
Bueno,
First of all, anyone should do whatever they feel like. There's no duty at all here. I think that's the only duty for some type of writers is to find his or her truth and tell it. If within his or her truth is society not talking about it and not expressing it in their literature, would be really not being committed to his or her duties. But regarding the literature I like and about myself, I can tell you that one of the genres or the literatures that I like most is the prophets' literature in the Bible. They were great poets, and through poetry they denounced the evils of their time. They spoke about God, of course, but mostly what they did was highlighting the hypocrisy of the societies where they lived and point out this double moral through their poetry and their literature. That was very powerful. The expressive power of literature needs to be born from this vision, from the vision of the important things in the life of a writer. If this writer is within a society where there's a social feeling, there's a lot of activity at that level, not telling it you would mean not to fulfill his duties with society. But you can also, in a complex society, you can also speak only about silence and move away completely from these controversies. And sometimes the expression of silence could be a total contrast of what's going on around him or her. If you talk only about silence and instead of denouncing a particular situation, could call or could connect you better to your own essence than a particular or specific social denounce. So I don't think that the answer is simple. It's not a black and or white answer. The answer to your question has to do with what each of us have inside. If you're just writing about something that is entertainment, I'm not interested about it. But if you write about something that you care about, whether it's social or whatever other topic, I think you're doing what you need to do. What about you? What do you think? What's your view on this?
Two things. I agree. A writer has to do what she or he feels like. And I was thinking about an artist, Agnes Martin. She lived in New York and was surrounded by her artist friends for many years. And then she disappeared, showed up in the desert in Mexico many years later, and was working just by herself. And she wrote that she was working with her back against the wall, and created all these things that people can relate to many years later, even though she didn't care about society. And also what you said about, I don't know if, well, I was also thinking when you were talking about violence, there are many ways to express violence in literature, and I was thinking of one of my favorite writers, Louis Ferdinand Céline, and because there you can see the language. He doesn't write about violence as much. Well, he does write about war and things, but what I think the violence is in his language, because he's so angry and he's furious, and the way he's building his sentences, that's where you find the language. So it would be very interesting to read a book about violence where you can see the violence in the language. Yeah. So I don't know if you have to like choose topics to write about, or if it's some other way that you can do it. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree very much with what you said. First, that no, there is absolutely no duty other than being true to yourself and to your own project. If that project is to tell the world what's wrong with it, fine. But if it's to tell the world how you feel or how your childhood was, that's fine too. And we had a very brilliant poet in Norway called Olav H. Hauge. Yesterday I spoke to his translator. I don't know if he's here today, translating him into Spanish. And he was in the 70s when Norway was radicalized by quite a big wave of young socialist students. They were criticizing him for not, because his pen was so brilliant, why do you not use it to this cause? You're just writing about all this, the weather and the wind and the birds like you always do. Don't you see what's happening? And he answered them brilliantly. He just wrote very short notice, I think, in the newspaper, saying that I understand, and now there has been the government has given out a decree stating that every diamond must be used to cut glass, and he never said anything more about it. That's perfect.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Y Mónica, para cerrar.
Sí, yo estoy de acuerdo con lo que dicen todos. Creo que
I agree with everyone has said. I don't think there is a duty or an obligation when it comes to writing. I think that writers do not really choose about what they write. It might seem that you're making a decision, but you're actually not making it, because you feel forced to write about something. Why does a writer write well about a topic if not because this topic really touches himself or herself very deep? And the fact that this topic really affects him or her has a lot to do with his experiences. We decide how to create a story if we write a novel, but we don't really choose what we write about. There's something beyond our decision. So I think that we need to follow this call, and that's part of being honest and to find this truth in your writing. But I would also like to add that I don't write anything that has to do with violence in Ecuador or the social situation or the situation about racism in Ecuador. I don't write at all about that. There are certain nuances about it in my literature, but this is not really the core of my literature. But I think that as writers, in one way or another, we need to know where we're writing from what privileges we're writing from, and not necessarily write about that, but be aware about this circumstance, because I think that's what allows us to understand fragility of literature and the fragility of the word. And I think this is a philosophical aspect that's very important in writing. I see that the bridges that we were trying to build, we have actually created them, that this has flowed very easily, and this is the living proof that literature is the best communication means that exists, and dogs as well. Because we were talking before this debate, we were talking about what would be the characteristics of Spanish that define Norwegian and Latin American literature, and she and I were talking about the names of our dogs, whose names are who are named after two writers coming from different traditions. In my case, Molly Bloom from the Ulysses, and in her case, it's the name is Becker. So our references in literature were the same. To
Ireland, that's where the bridge is.
Si alguien del público tiene...
If someone from the audience has a question that they would like to ask these four writers that we have with us and within this Nordic Days Festival, any doubt that they want to solve after this debate? I see that there's a question there. I would like to ask about the reader's perspective, what the Norwegian reader or the Nordic reader is looking for in literature. Do they look to find a reflection of themselves? Do they look for a reality that they have not lived? What is the Nordic reader looking for? If we only knew.
All readers are looking for I don't know, to feel some sort of recognition, maybe, to see someone who are completing your half-thought thoughts, to see the world in a completely different way and see it as a world where you belong. I think it's universal, and that's the great thing about literature.
Yeah, I think so too, but we have both. I mean, we have the readers that are picking up the latest crime novel at the airport, but we have a surprisingly big number of, or huge number of people buying contemporary novels that deals with all kinds of things. The one example is 10 years ago we had Knausgård. You must have heard about him. He wrote like 6 books, 3,500 pages about everyone he's ever met, his children, his wife's mental condition, etc., his parents. And I think no one understood that this was going to be a big thing. They printed not many books and then it's exploded. So Norwegian readers, as other readers, are capable of recognizing quality when it's there, and it's quite often every year there are quite a few books that has this, and it's still discovered, and that's very hopeful. I think.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Veo que hay otro brazo levantado.
Any other question? I see another arm raised in the room. Good afternoon. I think that when a writer writes, They are very careful about what they write, and they are very much influenced by their environment to the extent that they use their own language. And there's nothing more biased than language. But when I read a Japanese or Norwegian writer, when I read literature from writers who do not write in Spanish, I also like them, and they actually reach to me. And I wonder if this is not because literature, above other things, has something that is proper to it, that is its universality. There's something essential to literature, in the same way that here we find people from different races, from different origins. We're all human beings, and there's something essential to all of us, and literature is a manifestation of the human beings, is also essential. And this is why we like reading Norwegian writers, although we are Spanish and we have nothing to do with them. I don't know if you agree with this. Of course. Just a simple example, when we're children, we didn't think if literature was Spanish or from any other source. You read the legends from Becker or any other book, and it's just the essence of the human being written down with the great wealth of each region and each language and each writer. It happens the same with music. You don't think where music comes from if it's made by a Spanish, Italian composer, etc. The essence, I think, is shared by all arts that allow us to communicate with each other through time, through space. You can read a book by Homer as if it had been written yesterday. If there's a place where death disappears, not the difference between languages or between cultures or between countries, death itself actually vanishes in literature, because when you read a book from anybody who died 2,500 years or 10 years ago, in the book this author is still alive and will always be alive. Would you agree with that? I agree with what you said. I think that it's true. Experience, the human experience, is limited to a series of basic emotions such as fear, love, fear of death, and there are several basic emotions. But I think these basic emotions produce experiences that sometimes are not universal. Some books deal with universal experiences such as love. You can fall in love in Japan or in Nigeria, and it really doesn't matter. It's a human experience. However, if we talk about fear, there's the Lovecraft fear, for instance, or we can talk about fear in a novel related to racism or the lack of papers. And we do not all go through that sort of experience. We do not all experience racism or the lack of papers to enter a country. And I think the fear is the root of it all, but the human experience is so wide, so diverse. And I think that something that I'm amazed with is to open a book where I can read of an experience that I have never had, and through the words I can really feel that reading experience and get closer to an experience that you have not lived, and I think that is wonderful as well. Well, would you like to add something?
I have, over the years, my books have been translated into many languages, and I have discovered that I love translators. It's fantastic what they do. Often they don't get paid enough, and there's a lot of idealism, and it's a fantastic work, because literature is not like music. You cannot experience it like music without interpretation. And it's an impressive job, so I love them, and that's how it's possible what you say, that you can read Japanese or whatever, and still feel close to the original result.
Y qué mejor ocasión, ¿no?, para reivindicar.
What better occasion than to celebrate the work of translators than this debate and the festival called Nordic Days. Is there any other question?
Quería comentar. I would like to speak about the experience of reading. I think that reading is the best way to travel to a world that you cannot reach through a physical transportation. I mean, everyone, when we speak about the experience of traveling, how that enriches the individual that can get to know other cultures, literature is a way of traveling. We can travel into the past. We can try to feel how the Greeks felt when they read their authors, and if we want to know about Mexico, the best way to know Mexico is not just taking a plane, but reading its writers that are able to depict the reality in a very rich dimension. And I think that is the value of a writer. It has a lot to do with the occupation of writing. It is not enough to have something to say, you have to know how to say it. So a good writer is that one that is able to tell things in a way that reaches people, that touches people. What is extraordinary about literature is that it is very similar to taking a plane and traveling to a different place. If you want to get to know Spain, you don't need just to travel through the places and look at the landscape. Perhaps you will know better, you will get to know better Spain reading Spanish writers. And I think that in that sense, the writer has to have full liberty, full freedom to express himself or herself, because that piece of work is going to last much longer than the visual landscape. In the future, if someone wants to speak about the Spanish country in the 80s or the 90s or whatever age, they will resort to literature to know how things looked like at that point in time. It was just that remark that has a lot to do with the topic that we are dealing with. Yeah, and I think that we have traveled a lot, and this afternoon we have traveled to Ecuador, to Norway. We have visited many different countries, and we have gotten to know new ways of understanding literature thanks precisely to this conversation, to this exchange, this dialogue that we had. One last question. We are running out of time, but hi, can you hear me? Yes. Yeah, that's why Borges used to say, "I am not what I write. I am what I read and what I have read." That's what he said, speaking about just linking together all the ideas. Thank you. Okay, we shall close with this beautiful quote from Borges, and I would just like to thank all of you, Arlen, Kirsty, Ernesto and Monica, for being here, and I would also like to welcome them, and please visit us more often. And I would also like to thank the festival, Nordic Days, for making this encounter possible. Also the Telefónica Foundation venue for providing this excellent venue to have an exchange about literature and books and give wings to culture. Thank you.